Hi everyone, welcome to the 10th episode of Ask USP, a short podcast series by the US program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. I'm Kevin, an Associate Research Fellow USP.
Hi, this is Adrian, Research Fellow and Coordinator of USP.
And we'll be your host for this episode on Blinken's Asia Blitz. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's whirlwind tour across the region has had important implications for US engagement here. His busy schedule included two 2+2 meetings in Manila and Tokyo, where Mr. Blinken and US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met their Philippine and Japanese counterparts for high-level discussions. These meetings also produced key deliverables such as the announcement of a new Joint Force headquarters in Japan and a $500 million pledge to increase Manila's military capabilities. What can we make of Mr. Blinken's region-spanning visits, especially in the face of the election in November? Joining us today is Assistant Professor Chang, our IDSS colleague from the Military Studies program and also part of USP. Thanks for joining us today, Junyan.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
So to get the ball rolling, what are your initial thoughts about Blinken's visit to the region? Were there any meetings or developments that really stood out to you?
I think your original synopsis said it all. It was really about the meetings in the Philippines and in Japan. 2+2 meetings in these places, right? So my initial thoughts overall, this is probably one of the final chances for Blinken as the Secretary of State, right, to come to the region, right? Because we are about 2 months away from the US elections. And after that, the administration goes into its lame duck period, right, after the election results. So this is the final chance, but the whole thing went by so fast, right, and so rapidly. Blitz is really a right word here, and perhaps another synonym could possibly have been blink, right? No pun intended.
Junyan, when Blinken and Austin met their Japanese counterparts in Tokyo, one of the things that was announced was the creation of a new Joint Force headquarters for the US Military Command in Japan. What makes that announcement so significant?
Right, thanks, Adrian. So here, the first thing I would say is that in the media, what we commonly see reported was that this was perhaps somewhat in reaction to the Russian and North Korean agreement when Putin visited Kim Jong-un, right, in North Korea earlier a month or so ago. But here we must remember that actually Japan's parliament, right, in May 2024, enacted revised laws to set up a joint command headquarters for their own Japanese self-defense forces. And this was intended to be done by the end of March 2025 to bolster new security domains such as cyberspace and so on. But ultimately, what the Japanese are trying to do is basically to operationalize and consolidate, right? And thus, the US development can be seen to parallel this, and it is essentially about setting up a joint force headquarters to parallel, right, the Japanese Joint Forces Command, especially such that in events of emergency, then this parallel structure will be more integrated, and they will then respond to the emergency or crisis, right, in a much more coordinated manner than now. So this is an important part of the development.
So, Junyan, if I can follow up on that. So, in your view, how does these new developments in Japan, right, sort of compare to the US and Korean force structure on the Korean Peninsula?
So right now, with this change, it is likely that the US forces in Japan would then more resemble the US forces in Korea, which already had a joint structure, right, and greater autonomy essentially from US Indo-Pacific, right? But as to the exact specifics, right, then we don't quite know. However, I would also highlight that when it comes to Japan and Korea, then the main difference between these two forces is really that in times of crisis or war, then US forces in Korea, it will essentially take over operation command of the Korean forces themselves, right? So all along, the US forces command in Korea has existed at essentially a higher level, right, than the administrative headquarters that was US forces Japan.
That's a very good point. Although, here I would like to add that Blinken and Austin and the Japanese counterparts can propose this, right, creation of a US joint command for Japan, but it will also have to go through Congress, right? So this whole thing has to be authorized and appropriated through the NDAA, and hopefully we see that happen later this year. But thanks, Jinian.
Although I going back a little bit, from what I understand, US forces in Japan, they always lacked actual operational authority, right? It's been more of an administrative entity. So back during in 2011, when the Tohoku earthquake happened, they had to get people in from Pacific Command then to support relief efforts with the JSDF. So does this upgrade resolve this question of leadership, or is it just like one step in as part of a longer process?
So essentially, it is both yes and no, right? So with the Joint Forces Headquarters, Joint Command Headquarters, what will happen is that they will have greater autonomy, right? Okay, and it gives them greater capability, right, and capacity to do these things on the ground, right? Especially as a first reaction. Although they will still come under US Indo-PACOM, right? Okay, but being set up to that level, right? It means that they have greater autonomy to do more of these things. But naturally, depending on what the actual situation might be, then they could potentially require further support from US Indo-PACOM. But also, the no part is because I think the development also has to be seen essentially in the evolution of the US-Japan relationship, right, over the last, I would say, about 2 decades. And generally, you have seen the deepening of the relationship, right, especially militarily. So what they do, what they can do, and how they do it has also evolved over these 2 decades, actually, right? Okay, so essentially, this new command structure can also be seen as a culmination, right, of this 2 decades long evolution. Right, so all the way back in 2005, right, a meeting between the US and Japan Security Consultative Committee between then US State Secretary Condoleezza Rice and then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld with their Japanese counterparts, right, in 2+2. Already the US-Japan alliance in 2005 then was publicly linked to a set of common strategic objectives and operationally configured to advance these ends, right, for the first time. Okay, and so we can see how this has culminated here actually, right, with the setting up of the US Joint Forces Headquarters as well as the own Japanese Joint Forces Headquarters.
Just to follow up on that though, why do you think it took so long from that meeting in 2005 all the way until 2024 for this change to happen? Were there certain domestic hurdles that this move needed to pass, or is it more general in terms of challenges?
So there were clearly a few domestic hurdles, but also generally it's not so easy to change these kind of things rapidly. One important, I don't want to say hurdle, but one important challenge here was naturally the Japanese pacifist constitution and how it has been reinterpreted, right, over the last decade or so. So these things took time to change as well. Okay, but generally we see how these need to slowly evolve operationally.
And another thing you mentioned just now, I think, was the purpose of US Forces Japan. As compared to, say, US Forces Korea, it might have to end up dealing with a whole lot more kind of scenarios, right? Versus, say, in the case of South Korea, a North Korean invasion.
That's right. So potentially, right, we understand that the US-Japan relationship is a very strong and deep one, right? And potentially they can have different kinds of security scenarios, right, that may happen. We've seen, for instance, the 2011 earthquake that resulted in the Fukushima disaster. Right? And those things and other potential scenarios may happen.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Chin. I'll just sort of add that in terms of trying to get the Americans and the Japanese to be on the same page, as Chin correctly points out, is about the nature of Japan's pacifist constitution and also the nature of the US-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, right? Especially Article 6. which enjoins the US not just to defend Japan, but also to use Japanese facilities to quote-unquote contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security in the Far East, right? Which, again, depending on the specific contingency or issue, Japan may or may not partake in, right, because of constitutional restraints.
So, Junyuan, if I may then, how does this announcement of the new Joint Force headquarters for US military command in Japan, in conjunction with other things like, say, the trilateral meetings that the US has had with Japan and the Philippines or with Japan and South Korea, how does that all contribute towards US efforts to deter China here?
I suppose it goes back to the Biden administration's idea of integrated deterrence, which was prominent in the National Security Strategy of 2022. Now, what is integrated deterrence is perhaps not quite so straightforward to everyone. According to the document, right, it defines integrated deterrence as, I quote, the seamless combination of capabilities to convince potential adversaries that the costs of their hostile activities outweigh their benefits, end quote. Right, and therefore it entails integration across domains, across regions, right, towards different aspects of conflict, different domains and so on, from peace to war and other thresholds. Potentially, it involves integration across the entire US government and importantly, also with the US allies and partners, right? And thus, integrated deterrence is perhaps two things, right? As some administration officials have pointed out, it is about integration. It is therefore about making sure that US allies and partners can do greater interoperability, right? They have greater consensus. They've got essentially more commonalities, common objectives, and they want to pursue these objectives in somewhat the same manners. And deterrence is really then about conventional deterrence and therefore the boost to essentially try to enhance military capabilities, right, of US allies and partners, and hence, right, we see this in Japan, Korea, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam, for instance.
Yes, that's a issue. Adrian?
So, Junyuan, if I may, then how do you see the success of US integrated deterrence? I ask this because in light of Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea vis-a-vis the Philippines in the Second Thomas Shoal, and also in and around the Taiwan Strait.
Thanks, Adrian. Now, this is a complex question. Perhaps let me begin with the idea of deterrence itself. Here, conventional deterrence is meant to work against conventional threats, and therefore, whether it works against unconventional threats becomes problematic. Perhaps another way of looking at this is really that because China is deterred sufficiently, therefore it is resorting to other means, right? Especially those that are under the threshold of conflict. Such as in the South China Sea, we see Chinese militia and Coast Guard operating, and not so much the Chinese military operating there. This is perhaps therefore indicative of the success of conventional deterrence. Now, as to my earlier point about whether or not conventional deterrence works against unconventional elements, then clearly not so easily, not so translatable, and therefore the resort to other means. Here, integrated deterrence may play a role, but naturally we also don't expect integrated deterrence to be the silver bullet for many of these different things that we've been talking about, right? Especially in relation to China. The situation will be a lot more complex. Here, perhaps my favorite example is the idea of freedom of navigation operations, right? Or US FONOPs for short. We must remember that US FONOPs are essentially not military operations, right? They are essentially actually political protests against excessive maritime claims, right? Just that these political protests happen to be performed by military vessels. Thus, my point is that it is not therefore a deterrent signal per se, right? It is a political one, right, against excessive maritime claims. And for the US has done foreign ops not just in the South China Sea against China, right? It has performed foreign ops in many other parts of the world against multiple parties and not just China, right? Okay, and therefore we shouldn't see that just because China has continued some of its actions, okay, and so on, this is not the failure of deterrence per se. The failure of deterrence will be very clear-cut, I think, right? Okay, in that a conventional war will break out. So down here, we want to be sure of what deterrence is meant to do, okay, and what it is not meant to do.
Following that train of thought then, Jinian, I'd like to ask, so the US, it pledged $500 million to the Philippines under its foreign military financing scheme. How significant is this gesture? And does this also include, say, upgrades to the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement basis, the ANCA basis, or is it largely going towards equipment and training as far as we know?
Thanks, Kevin. So, as far as I can make out from the media reports on the matter, right, the $500 million is purely to modernize the Philippines Armed Forces and as well as Coast Guard. Right? Another US $128 million is being earmarked to do key infrastructure projects, right, at the military bases that the US currently has access to under the Philippines-US Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. They should be seen as separate items, right, generally speaking. As to the amount, clearly Blinken described the $500 million as a once-in-a-generation investment, and it is a significant amount, right, to help the Philippines. As to whether or not they can absorb such a huge amount of aid, right, and how long it would take them to do some of these things, then it depends on which particular areas the Philippine Armed Forces and Coast Guard want to focus on, right? But clearly have these sums of money being discussed.
Thanks, Jinian. Then, if I may ask you, where do you think the Philippines Armed Forces is going to spend this $500 million that the US has pledged?
Right, thanks, Adrian. So, whilst that $500 million is significant, we must also understand that generally speaking, okay, and especially as compared to other militaries in the region, then the Philippines Armed Forces and Coast Guard perhaps not quite so strong and effective, even bad works in many areas. So the $500 million, whilst significant, has actually got a lot of different issue areas for the Philippines to address. It's hopefully money well spent to upgrade, where they need it most. And naturally, when it comes to the Philippines, then their greatest flashpoint today is in the South China Sea, right? Okay, and therefore, I think efforts should be made towards boosting their navy as well as their coast guard especially.
Yeah, although at the same time, we've noticed from developments over the past, say, 2 months, especially with regard to the Typhoon missile system, that sometimes the acquisition of certain kinds of equipment can also cause, political problems for them, particularly with regards to China.
With regard to the Typhoon missile system, I understand that it is only in the Philippines because of a particular exercise, and with the conclusion of the exercise, the intention is to remove those missiles, right? But overall, naturally, this goes back to the entire idea of the security dilemma. Different parties have got different perspectives as to what some of these advanced capabilities may do. For one party, it may be meant to increase their security, okay, but the other party may correspondingly see these, however, as decreasing their own security. So we expect these things to be par for the course.
Yeah.
And importantly, given the relationship between the Philippines and China, greater investment in military capabilities on either side will be seen under this security dilemma umbrella, if not for the outright provocation, right, that the parties may perceive. However, it is important that we have seen an agreement between the Philippines and China in terms of resupplying the Philippines vessel on the
Sierra Madre.
Right, the Sierra Madre, right, and that's helpful to reduce tensions, to get parties to cooperate and work together, okay, and diffuse essentially, right, potential conflicts in the South China Sea.
To wrap up then, Jinian, do you have any thoughts about the significance and limits of Blinken's visit overall?
Right, thanks, Kevin. So his visit is a long line of the Biden administration's engagement with the region, and it should be seen first and foremost in this light. Right, it is about telling the different US allies and partners in the region, right, that the US remains committed to the region. And this is despite the domestic upheaval we saw last month with the Democratic nomination and so on and so forth. So what Blinken is trying to do really is trying to reassure US allies and partners, trying to demonstrate the US's enduring commitment to the region despite domestic events and sometimes crisis. And naturally, in this regard, this is his fifth or sixth time in the region since the Biden administration came to power about 4 years ago. That is actually not a small number of times that Blinken himself has visited the region, right? And on top of Blinken, we've had other visits to the region, right, including Secretary of Defense Austin and so on. So clearly, the US remains committed to the region, and it is basically here to stay. Having said that, we all understand that the US presidential elections are coming up, okay, and we expect the administration's focus to shift domestically. Okay, and depending on the outcome of the elections, then some of their priorities could conceivably change. If there is a change to a Republican administration, then what we need to look out for is really the new administration's foreign policy priorities for the region. Generally, I expect the US to continue to demonstrate its commitment to the region, okay, although naturally some of these policies and so on, right, may shift on the ground different in administration.
So, Adrian, do you have any points to add?
No, I think what I'll do is just basically reinforce what Julian has said, that there's probably going to be more continuity than discontinuity, even if there is a Republican administration taking office next year.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And it's probably going to have to be a topic of at least one of our future episodes.
Exactly. So we'll save it, all that good stuff, for that episode.
Definitely. And in fact, just on this visit as well, we didn't go into Singapore's 123 Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with the US. We didn't talk about Mr. Blinken's visit to Vietnam and the subsequent Commerce Department decision about Vietnam's bid for market economy status. There's lots of topics to talk about in future episodes, of course. Well, in that case, thank you for your time, Adrian and Jin Yuan, and thank you everyone for tuning in.